Long Voyage back, part 48. We are now on page 237 and we're starting the last final piece. This is part 5 and it's called Spirit. Hope you guys have been entertained. We have not got that much longer to go. Ready? Sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. The war, the Holocaust, the war of missiles, bombers, submarines, lasers, satellites, and all the sophisticated technology of modern science, this war between the United States with its Western and Oriental allies and the Soviet Union with her allies was over. No more missiles were being fired, nuclear explosions had ceased. Although death still came out of the sky, it now fell gently, subtly, like a soft rain. Although people still died, they no longer disappeared in a flash of light or exploded into fragments like a smashed pumpkin, but died in more natural animal ways, of starvation, of typhoid, of cholera, of dysentery, of pneumonia, of weariness, and of grief. Although no victory had been declared, no defeat acknowledged, the big war was over. Another had begun. The new war, in a tradition as old as humanity itself, found the former enemies fighting on the same side against new enemies. Those who had survived the first war, often finding themselves with radioactive food and undrinkable water, with diseases known and unknown afflicting them and medical care scarce or absent, fled to those places that they supposed to be safer. The southern nations were first appalled by the invasion, then frightened, and finally angered by it. If the white nations of the north had blown up the world, let them not try to escape the consequences by fleeing south. Thus the new war had begun. It had actually been going on since the first week of the war. Venezuela's navy had forcibly prevented US Navy ships from refueling in its ports. In the ensuing sea battle, tactical nuclear bombs had been dropped. In miniature, such battles had been repeated throughout the world ever since. American and Russian ships and planes, low on fuel, their home bases destroyed, sought refuge in the neutral countries to the south. First their ships or planes were impounded, their crews quarantined or interned. Later they were sunk or shot down, the survivors killed on the spot. As the warring nations slowly stopped being nations, so too did their navies, armies and air forces slowly stop being armies, navies and air forces. Individual units, a ship, a plane, a company of infantry, a tank squadron, began mini invasions of their own. Soon any unidentified or foreign ship, plane or person was considered an enemy to be eliminated. When the unknown epidemic that came to be called either the plague or Nevada X began to spread from the American West down through Mexico to Central America and, in long, deadly bursts, to other countries throughout the world, foreigners, especially Americans, were feared, resented and resisted all the more. To protect themselves, the southern nations simply shut down all commercial air and sea traffic with the northern hemisphere. In effect, they tried to build a wall and ordered the war and those who survived it not to enter. Within the nations of the southern hemisphere, other walls were also built. The rich retreated to their luxury homes and apartments and tried to keep the police and the military forces in line. In the West Indies and Central America, the desperate and starving masses had already risen up and forcibly taken from those who still had something all they had. Slow starvation and susceptibility to disease thus became universal. In South America, where food was still available and disease less rampant, the rich were able to hold on, while the great masses of people, unemployed and barely fed, became weaker and weaker, more and more desperate. And so, a third war was beginning, a war that was again as old as humanity, but was exacerbated by the gross overpopulation in the late 20th century. The war between those who had enough to eat and those who did not. The governments of South America held out, shooting everyone who resisted, shooting all who tried to cross their borders, shooting everyone who questioned the siege mentality they hoped would sustain them. And thus throughout the world, the war refugees were fighting a usually losing battle for survival. The war was over. The survivors didn't notice. The convoy, composed of Vagabond and Scorpio, was reunited off the northern coast of Anguilla late in the afternoon of the day following their escape from St. Thomas. Ollie and Jim had brought Scorpio through the wild, bone-jarring 100-mile passage, but only after blowing out 2 sails, developing frightening leaks that had them pumping almost continuously and having Greg's arm broken. With the wind and seas much diminished and their ships anchored off the lee shore of Antigua, those on Vagabond and Scorpio transported supplies, adjusted ship's crews, established radio frequencies and hours of transmission, as well as signalling procedures and defence strategies in case of attack, and set their course and rendezvous points in case they unexpectedly lost sight of each other. But even as they took heart from their safe passage, Lisa reported to Neil something that Katia had mentioned briefly as they were fleeing the pirate estate. Lisa and Katia had apparently smoked a joint with a plague victim aboard Mollycoddle. In Katia's brief emotional account of her capture and imprisonment, she had warned Neil tearfully that a black girl aboard Mollycoddle had been thrown overboard when Michael had realised how feverish she was. Katia had hysterically offered not to sail with them, but Neil had been obsessed with getting back to Mollycoddle and out to sea, and had barely understood. And if he had, he would have still brought her along. Neil passed this along to everyone and ordered them to always use the same personal cup for drinking and the same plate and utensils for eating. Oscar and his shipmates insisted that Jim and Lisa be transferred back to Vagabond. This was done, and neither one was to be involved with food preparations or galley clean-up. Jim joked that it was the best excuse for getting out of doing the dishes he'd ever had. Neil also suggested that mouth-to-mouth contact should be avoided. If the disease didn't appear in a week or 10 days, they could assume that they were safe and relax some of the stringency of this regime, perhaps permitting the holding of hands. If there was no sign of the disease after 10 days, they could have an orgy. But despite Neil's efforts to make light of these new regulations, the effect was to make everyone realise that they might be carrying with them the very thing they'd gone to sea to escape. While they anchored off Anguilla, Neil sent Jim and Sheila ashore to locate the nearest doctor. They returned 10 hours later with the depressing information that there were no longer any doctors left on the whole island. They had all fled. Starvation was almost universal. Actually, there was one old doctor they had located in a small fishing village, but he was feeble and indicated he couldn't cope with a bullet wound in the stomach. Philip had been placed on the dinette settee in the main cabin, where the pitching and rolling of Vagabond was least felt during their topsy-turvy passage through the storm. Now he was running a fever. Macklin indicated that an infection had taken hold in the abdomen. He had started Philip on an antibiotic, was giving him codeine for the pain, and was feeding him only liquids. Philip was urinating normally but not had a bowel movement since he had been shot. There was still no evidence of internal hemorrhaging. Most of the pain was in his back, where the bullet had shattered a rib. Jean's wound showed no signs of infection, and she insisted on being up and about with her left arm in a sling. Since their proposed southeasterly course towards the eastern tip of Brazil and the mouth of the Amazon would leave them with never more than a day's sail downwind to land, Sheila advised Neil to go ahead and they would see if Philip improved. They both knew that the medical skill on most of the islands was probably limited. The farther south they got, the more likely they'd be to find competent doctors. Neil made no effort to hide how long and difficult a passage they would have simply to get south to the equator, much less to find a home someplace along the coast of Brazil or on the islands of Ascension or St. Helena, if that was their decision. By their third day at sea, Oscar and Tony were already complaining. It was a voyage of almost 2,000 miles to the equator, largely against the prevailing winds and along an inhospitable coast. If the leaks in Scorpio's hull couldn't be patched, they might not be able to continue as a fleet. Although the leaking was reduced from what it had been during the initial stormy passage from the Virgins, it took 5 to 10 minutes in an hour to pumping to clear the Scorpio's bilge. Oscar and Tony maintained that Barbados might make a possible haven, but Neil, happy that the northeasterly wind was letting them head directly southeast towards the equator, refused. Their goal was to cross the equator to escape the fallout and plague of the northern hemispheres and to get to a country that had not been overwhelmed by the effects of war. Neil also felt it was important to avoid land until the plague had run its course. But from the beginning there was an atmosphere of heaviness and conflict aboard that was new. The death of Katia, the wounding of Philip and Jean, the knowledge that at any moment one or more of them might be stricken with a mortal illness, the awareness that for all the effort and the violence of their raid on the Mollycoddle pirates, they were still living on short rations and still depending on the sea for their sustenance. All this created a depression in most of the crew that was deeper than it had ever been before. Yet the effect on Neil was quite different and unexpected. Something had broken inside of him. Some coiled spring that had him tensely concentrating every moment on the right strategies for survival was no longer there. For him, even though he acted with all his skill and energy, the worst had happened. A loved one killed, 2 others wounded. Some part of him gave up, or rather, some major part of him now accepted his own fallibility, mortality, inability to deal with the forces attacking them. He still commanded, but without the vehemence and that had driven him since the wars began. Instead of feeling his usual rage at the forces' destructions when he realised that Lisa might be infected with the plague, he felt strangely tranquil, even gentle. When Tony publicly attacked him for the death of Katia, Neil was not angry at Tony at all. He knew that he was at fault and that he was helpless to do otherwise. And now he accepted both. He was helpless. Somehow the new awareness liberated him. Although he and Frank had had no formal reconciliation, Neil found himself feeling his old affection for him and turning most of the decisions about sailing of the Vagabond over to him. On Scorpio, Ollie was captain, and with watch teams led by Tony, Oscar and Arnie. On Vagabond, Frank, Jim and Sheila were the mates, Jean, Lisa and Macklin crewing as necessary. Neil no longer made any effort to disguise his feelings for Jean. He touched her, caressed her hair, tended to her wound, spoke to her lovingly. He made no effort to make love to her, both because of his concern for Frank and out of fear that he might be a carrier of the disease. When Neil listened to the shortwave radio now and heard about the horrors others were facing throughout the world, he felt he was part of a larger family. On the second night out from Antigua, in particular, he listened to two new ham operators, one in Florida and the other in Texas. At first he thought the anonymous voices had revised his Americanism, reminded him of his American roots and citizenship, but when he thought about it further, he realised that the larger family he felt connected to was that of the survivors. He felt no connection with the President and his martial law and executive orders and his empty claims of victories. He felt no connection with the heroic pushers of buttons, the pilots of bombers, the submarine captains, the generals generaling from half a mile down inside the earth somewhere. His people were the survivors, survivors all over the world, American, English, German, Russian, yes, Russian even, fleeing this incredible madness. Strangely, Neil found he could read again. From the first day of the Holocaust until the evening they had dropped anchor off Antigua, he realised that he had been unable to read fiction or history or philosophy. Everything had seemed so trivial or so irrelevant to his face for survival. Then suddenly, that evening, he spent 2 hours reading Tolstoy's War and Peace, one of 24 classic novels he had aboard. The adolescent joys of Natasha and Sonia and young Count Rostov brought tears to his eyes, the joys that Lisa and Katya were missing, had missed. The Battle of Austerlitz, although totally remote from their experiences of the previous month, seemed so real, so human, that his own life and wounds of Philip and Jean seemed human, bearable. He knew that the joy he found in Tolstoy represented, paradoxically in the light of Katya's tragic death, his strange recovered joy in life, and his acceptance of his powerlessness. Jean seemed to have been affected by Katya's death, her own wound, and the fact that she had killed a man in a slightly different way. She appeared more pensive and puzzled. Neil could see that she too was less desperate than they both had been for most of the earlier time, but he could also see that she was watching for signs of illness in Lisa. She hadn't quite decided how she could take another such blow. Neil and Jean spent more time talking, not just about the day-to-day details of survival, but also about the question of who was to blame for everything that had happened, large and small. Although Jean saw that her killing Larry had been an act of self-defence, when Neil reminded her that the pirates had kidnapped Katya, she hadn't replied, and Neil felt remorse again. They had retrieved Katya only to sail her away to her death. As they talked away, their third afternoon at sea, Scorpio was visible 200 yards off to the starboard. Both boats were moving smoothly in the brisk trade wind, sailing slightly to windward, but not enough to cause heavy slamming. Neil was at the helm, Jean on the port seat of the newly opened central cockpit. The sky was clear, the day already warm. Jean was dressed as she usually was in shorts and a bikini top, Neil in cut-off jeans. She noticed that the tendons in the backs of his legs were showing, and realised that he had lost weight. His severe face was made even more severe by the deep lines that creased it. It saddened her to seem like this. "We're failing," Jean said to him impulsively. "We're divided and failing. We're making all the same mistakes that led to the war in the first place." Like everyone else aboard, she referred to it as the war, not the Third World War or anything else. To her, to them, it was the war. All previous wars being insignificant skirmishes in comparison. It could not have a number because it had no predecessor and couldn't conceivably have a sequel. Neil turned to look at her but didn't reply. "We're failing," she repeated. "We're alive, Jean," he finally said. "We're not yet starving to death. We're 16 people sailing away from danger. We've made mistakes, but we've avoided worse ones." "But what's the sense," said Jean, "to get food for a week or two? Philip and I get shot. To escape, Katya dies. We must be doing something wrong." Neil winced. "I know it seems that way," he said, "but illness, violence and death are the new norm. They can't be avoided." "And there's Frank," Jean said, as if the name itself summarised her entire problem. She searched Neil's face to see if he had an answer for her, and nodding to her, he gestured with his free hand for her to come to him. She went to his side, and he took her hand. "Frank hasn't asked us to stop loving each other," Neil went on, "although that's the only thing that would change things for him. He's only asked us not to make love. For the time being, with Frank as weak as he is, that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make for him." "I know," said Jean, "but as you yourself said, it's really no solution. It doesn't stop him from resenting you, us." No, it doesn't. That's what I can't stand, she said. He and you were friends, and he and I now... When she looked up at him, he returned her gaze sternly and removed his hands from hers. He sighed. You expect too much of us, Jean, he said. Good people hurt each other. It's built into the universe. There are only 10 of us, Jean persisted. Surely we're capable of creating a happy life for 10 people. No, I don't think we are, Neil said. Not when those 10 are forced to live with each other whether they like it or not. Not when those 10 are threatened with death every day. No, Jean, be thankful your children are with you, that I love you, and that people like Ollie and Philip and Sheila have come into our lives. For the rest, conflict and suffering and death will be in the air we breathe for an awfully long time. But if there was peace in Neil's heart, there was nothing but dissension in his fleet. In the late afternoon of the 5th day out from Antigua, Tony and Oscar, who had asked to come over to have a conference with Neil, arrived aboard Vagabond. Frank had visited Scorpio at midday, while Neil was taking the noon sunshot, and he was to be in on the conference too. Although the main cabin would be hot and stuffy, Tony suggested they go below for privacy, forgetting that Philip was berthed there. Instead they sat in the back of the wheelhouse area. Actually, the wheelhouse had ceased to exist. Only the plexiglass windows forward remained. Neil had ordered it torn down, so that the 6x10 plywood and fiberglass roof could be sawed in two, glued together and fiberglassed over to make a new dagger board. The walls had come down too. Vagabond now had open cockpits running athwart the entire boat after the cabins in the 3 hulls. 2 small sun awnings were rigged up over most of this area, but it was also open to the wind and weather. Oscar and Frank sat on the aft seat, Neil and Tony next to each other on the port seat, gaunt, bearded and unkempt. They reminded Neil of 4 derelicts gathering to share a bottle of cheap wine, only there was no wine. Well, gentlemen, said Neil gaily, this is quite a formal occasion. You apparently have something you want to discuss. That's right, said Tony, looking Neil firmly in the eye. This beating to the windward is going to break Scorpio apart. We're pumping half the time. It's time to change course. We've already discussed this, Neil replied quietly. Jim, Ollie and I all agree our present course is best. Frank, Mac and I have all been coming over to help with the pumping, and you won't take Jim. But everyone on my ship except the old guy is in favour of sailing to Barbados, said Oscar. Since Frank agrees, we outvote you. Take Scorpio and go, Neil said quietly. No, said Oscar. We don't want to split things up if we can help it. We want to re-establish the normal order of things. Wouldn't that be nice, said Neil. Tell him, Frank, said Tony, first about the captain thing. Frank cleared his throat and slowly raised his eyes to Neil. Great half-moons were deep hollows under both his eyes, and the skin around his neck was loose. Sitting hunched over, staring downward, had become his characteristic posture. When you announced you were captain of Vagabond in Cheapspate, Frank began slowly, I went along with it. I went along because back then there were 20 or so madmen aboard, and your speech shaped them up. He paused. 19 madmen, Tony interjected. Remember, I was there too. Frank blinked once, cleared his throat again and went on. Now there aren't, he said. Now me, Tony, Jim, Ollie, even Sheila, I guess, any one of us could be captain of the Vagabond and run the ship. Maybe not as well as you, but competently. Neil held his gaze steadily on Frank, but did not respond. In becoming your first mate, I temporarily forfeited my ownership rights to Vagabond, Frank continued. In those days, with an untrained crew, it was probably a good way to do things. Now, I'm reasserting my rights as owner. And I'm reasserting my rights as owner of Scorpio, said Oscar. Oh, said Neil, choosing to look at Oscar, whose long hair and bushy moustache was tangled and streaked with salt, making him look the least reputable of the derelicts. And what does that mean? It means I want Tony as captain and not the old man. And what's wrong with Captain Ollie? He never gives any orders except the ones you give him, Oscar replied. Tony, Arnie and I run the watches the way we want anyway. Neil laughed. I'd say he sounds like a perfect captain. I want Tony, Oscar repeated solemnly. And what does reasserting ownership of the Vagabond mean, Frank? Neil asked. He saw that Frank's gaze could not entirely conceal the uncertainty, anxiety even, that Frank must have been feeling. It means that the captain serves at my pleasure, he replied slowly. It means that I set the course, the captain only determines how to get there. And the same on my boat, said Oscar. Neil was surprised that he no longer felt anger or resentment, but rather a strange kind of serenity that was only slightly tinged with sadness. Very slowly he shook his head. No, good friend, he said to Frank. I didn't take the ownership of Vagabond away from you. The war did. The war's over, Neil, Frank replied. You don't seem to accept it, but it's over. No, it's not, Frank, Neil said calmly. And at least not the war that deprived you of your ownership rights, and yours too, Oscar. No, I'm afraid none of us owns anything anymore. That's convenient for you to say, said Tony, since you don't own a boat. Frank doesn't own Vagabond, Neil went on, and I don't own my captaincy or my other skills. You don't think I'm free to do what I want, do you? Your lives depend on my skills, so I'm not free to withdraw them, irrespective of likes or dislikes. Our lives depend on Vagabond and Scorpio. You two don't own them any more than the man who happens to own all the water on a crowded desert island owns the water. By the nature of the situation, everyone needs it, owns it. Bullshit! Tony exploded. It's Frank's boat. All that intellectual crap doesn't change it. You're right, Tony, Neil responded mildly. My intellectual crap doesn't change it. The world changed it. Frank was watching him, his uncertainty more evident now. Oscar looked sullen, Tony angry and defiant. Neil rose from his seat, stretched his arms and yawned. If you think you own your boats, go ahead and think so, he said, and then turned to look directly down at Frank. But if you try to act as owner, then the world, your friends, your family, will collapse. You cannot reinstate the old ways by decree. He watched Frank for a moment. Frank was hunched over, looking at the floor, and then turned to Oscar and Tony. Ollie is an excellent captain because he gives orders only to maintain order, he went on. Tony here is an excellent sailor, stronger and quicker than Ollie, and Tony would make an absolutely shitty captain. Tony would give orders not to maintain order, but to demonstrate that he was captain, and that's the perfect formula for chaos. You conceited bastard, said Tony. The war's over, Neil, Frank said in a husky voice. You're still running. I believe you'll always be, but it's over. It's not over, Neil replied, and I intend to keep running. Dragging us down with you, said Frank. No. If enough people want to take a different course, then we'll split up, said Neil. The cowards can come with me, and the brave ones return to the West Indies. And who determines which group takes which boat? Asked Frank. Not me, Frank, not you. Vagabond should go to those who have to sail windward, Scorpio to those who can use the best. And who decides that? Said Frank. The goddamn owners decide is who, snapped Tony. There are no easy solutions, Neil said softly to Frank. Think about it, Frank. Would throwing me overboard really solve any of your problems? We're not going to throw you overboard, Tony interjected, good as the idea might be. Think about it, Frank, said Neil, still without raising his voice. Get away from these clouds and see the world as it is. Tony's fist caught Neil just below his left ear and sent him stumbling across to the opposite seat, where he fell awkwardly half on his knees. What the hell are you doing? Frank shouted, getting to his feet and holding out an arm to keep Tony from Neil. Neil glanced up at Tony looming over him a few feet away and waited for his head to clear and the ringing to stop. This bastard can't keep calling me names and expect me to take it, Tony barked out in reply to Frank. If he thinks he's captain, let him show it with his fists. Neil's head was slowly clearing, and he stood up. He noticed at the helm Sheila had half turned towards them, watching. I'm sorry I called you names, Tony, he said quietly. I don't blame you for being angry. You chickening out? I made a mistake in insulting you, Neil went on. I apologise. Jesus, what is this? And if you ever pull something like that again, I'll smash your nose out the back of your head, Neil concluded. He brushed past Tony and went down to the main cabin. At the wheel, Sheila held Vagabond steady on the course.